The College Football Committee has a love affair with the SEC, so we're going to debate it this time on Football Frenzy. Welcome to the Frenzy, everybody. This Wednesday night, November 20th. The College Football Rankings are out. We got some NFL talk, perhaps, if we even get to it. Welcome to the show, everybody. It's the Iceman, Matt Freight, still from windy Dartmouth, Massachusetts. And as always, the coach, Brad Powell, in Peoria, I assume. What's up, buddy?
Iceman, yes, sir. Coming to you live from, just north of Peoria and the bustling metropolis of Lake, Illinois. But doing well, my friend. I think we're getting our first little burst of snow flurries of the season occurring right now. I think Chicago is supposed to they might get an inch or two, but we might just get like I said, flurries, whatever, a dusting, as they say.
Dusting.
Yeah. So, yeah, winter weather is upon us, and but I'm not worried about that. I kind of like it before Christmas, before the first of the year. After the first of the year, it's just cold and it sucks. It's miserable, but I don't mind a little snow and things to go along with the holiday cheer. But plenty going on in the world of football for sure. We have the new college football playoff rankings that came out. There's a lot of people have a lot to say about it. We'll just put it that way.
Everybody has something to say all the time. But before we get into that, I do want to say that for you college basketball fans, we did an episode of Braves Talk a little bit earlier today. The Braves are on a little bit of a heater. They're 3-1, headed to Myrtle Beach. So if you're somebody watching and you haven't caught that yet, and you're a big Bradley basketball fan, make sure to get out there and watch Braves Talk, support all that good stuff. And you mentioned about having things to talk about. One of the things before we dive into this playoff thing is like we've talked about family, I think, on this show. And I think that you and I have been pretty transparent about kind of where we are with our family. We're family men. This is something that we enjoy to do. I think one of the hardest things, though, taking care of your kids is one thing, but it's when you have to start dealing with your parents getting older and you aging as well, and dealing with that stuff. It's been quite an emotional ride for me. So I think it's important for me to thank you live on this show for obviously being my friend offline, online, but I think also for the people that watch this and for the fact that we have this, because it's been nice to be able to leave the situation. I don't know if you can tell how tired and worn out that I am from the last 2 weeks. It is nice to be able to come on here and talk with people, talk sports, something that's trivial in the end. But as we get closer to the holiday season with Thanksgiving next week, I think it's important to think about what you have and be grateful for what you have, even if it's maybe not what you want, because at some point in time, life is going to take it all from you.
You're absolutely right. And, personally, of course, I'm happy to obviously be here. Our friendship has been great, and it's been a two-way street. I think we've both been there for each other through some difficult times, and that's what friendship's all about. And I think when it comes to doing this podcast throughout, the grind of life and the things that it throws at us, it's sort of that one little piece of your normal routine, especially you're away from home. You're not sleeping in your own bed. You've got a bunch of crazy stuff going on, and being able to do this is the one piece of normal that you can cling to in your life right now. And so I think that shouldn't go understated. The value of being able to get out here and do this, and the fact that people care enough to listen and watch and participate makes it even better.
I agree with you. Now, I did buy a coffee pot recently because it had to happen. So it'll be here whenever I need to be here. So we talked about the college football playoff. Here's another wonderful graphic that I have stolen from somewhere, but these are your current graphics as we know them. And of course, the top four, pretty sure, stayed mostly the same, or at least looks very, very similar. I think that these are starting to look a little bit similar every single week, especially the top half of it. But Oregon 1, Ohio State 2, Texas 3, Penn State 4. And that's obviously what a lot of people are looking at. That's pretty much stayed the same. Indiana jumping up to 5. Notre Dame at 6. So I want to start there because that kind of hits a little close to home for you. And I did send you something recently from our buddy Budge, who I think wasn't necessarily trying to undersell Notre Dame, but I think he's been tweeting a lot about the committee and what they're doing. And he said that obviously that Northern Illinois loss seems to not matter to the committee. And I think you're a little pissed about that.
I wouldn't say I'm pissed because the loss matters. It's not a good loss. There's no way to like put lipstick on a pig. It was a bad loss. It's a 2-point loss at home, week 2, coming off of a big emotional road win at Texas A&M. Right? It was the prototypical trap game. Now, that's not an excuse. I mean, Notre Dame was leading the game in the fourth quarter and pissed it away, and Northern Illinois was the better team that day. I'm not going to sit there and try to excuse the loss, but you can't say. I don't know how you could say that the committee must be ignoring that loss. So what are they supposed to do? Ignore what's happened since then? Like that's my argument, I guess. Are they supposed to
Yeah.
ignore the the 8 straight wins that have occurred since that loss and in the fashion in which those wins have taken place? I mean, Notre Dame has to date has beaten 6 teams that are bowl eligible. Penn State and Indiana combine for 4.
Right.
And so like the schedule, their strength of schedule I think it was like 75 when we talked about it last week,
Yeah.
it's not great, especially when you stack it up against maybe some of these SEC schools, especially. But it's not as dog crap as people think it is. I mean, there's just a lot of average on their schedule. There's not a ton of someone posted a graphic that showed the picture of the Miami, Ohio, Northern Illinois scored. Miami, Ohio was up like 17-0. I think they played last night, maybe, or maybe they're playing tonight. I don't know. I think it was last night. And they're like, oh, so this is the team that beats Notre Dame. The committee still has Notre Dame as high as they do. And I'm like, well, you realize that Notre Dame also beat the team that's beating them 28-3, right? And I mean, it's just like I don't know what people expect. I understand that Notre Dame is polarizing. You either love them or you hate them, and it's very easy to sit there and look at them and be like they're being favored. There's Notre Dame bias. I've admitted here on the show multiple times that I do think that Notre Dame does get a little bit of a boost because they're Notre Dame, because they draw well. Okay. They're a good draw, and that means more money. And all of this stuff, whether we want to believe it or not, is about making as much money as possible. Unfortunately, that's the case. And I, this is all still going to change so much. That's
It
what's
is.
crazy about it.
And there's plenty of time for it to change. But looking at this, I think the biggest thing that changed, the 2 games I think that mattered the most, obviously Georgia, Tennessee was a big one. Now, both of those teams are in as of today. And the biggest one, obviously, is BYU losing to Kansas, which is not a good loss at all. Like, it's not as if they lost to the best team that they played. They lost to a Kansas team that was not great. And so hanging on by a thread was BYU. And now, of course, they're out as of this. So when you look at these things, like I look at these teams, and this isn't something we talked about earlier, but like if you look at Oregon, right? Oregon gets the benefit of the doubt for probably having the best win in the country, and then of course having won all their other games. You think that's fair?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
I don't know. I don't know if there's a single person on the planet that has a problem with Oregon being number 1. I think
No.
that's one thing that, like, out of all the things in this playoff, I think that's the one thing that people can agree on.
And Ohio State, I think, gets the nod for having the best loss so far this season, having lost obviously to the number 1 team in the country. They looked okay doing it, and they've kicked the crap out of basically everybody else that they played. Texas, that's an interesting one. I think you've said that it's an eye test. They're going on the ceiling. It's an obviously good football team, but if you look at the wins that they have, I think their quality wins are Vanderbilt and Arkansas. It's not terrific. Penn State is kind of in the same boat. You already mentioned it. They don't have a quality win. The one really good team they played, they didn't beat. So that's interesting. Indiana, undefeated. They're going to get their chance against Ohio State, which is another game at noon, by the way. So that's awesome for the Big Ten. But they are lower, I think, because it's perceived that they haven't played anybody, and you just brought that up. And then there's Notre Dame, who, as you said, has a more quality schedule than you thought. Alabama obviously has a couple of losses, but also has some really good wins under their belt. Miami is perceived as the one team that's going to get there from the ACC, but again, they've struggled. You see what I'm saying here? Like every single team has some different level of criteria that we're looking at. And then you get to the bottom of this and you have Ole Miss, Georgia, Tennessee, and Boise, right? So that's 5 SEC teams out of 12. And 3 of them have all beaten up on each other. So they're all good football teams, though.
Oh, yeah. Well, then you have the sixth team just there on the outside, and A&M. A&M is
Yes.
tied for first in the SEC right now and controls their own destiny for a crack at the playoff. I mean, essentially, what they're saying by putting them at 15 is that they are assuming that Texas A&M will lose to Texas, not this week, but next week. And that very well may happen. But the thing is this is a rivalry game that hasn't happened, unfortunately. And like ever since Texas A&M has gone to the SEC, these two schools haven't played. And so Texas A&M has got to be licking their chops for this because this is going to be a game at Kyle Field. So for a chance to go to the playoff, and it will. I mean, I don't know if it puts him a shoe in for the playoff, but it certainly gives him a berth to the SEC title game, and then we'll
Yeah.
see where it goes from there. But so what happens there, right? Let's say A&M has two losses right now. Let's say
Yep.
they beat Texas, go to the SEC championship game, and lose. So they've got a great win. They finish the season really strong, but they've got let's say they lose a tight game in the SEC title game. Now they have three losses. What do you do with them? Especially when you look at some of these other teams that are going to have two losses in the SEC that didn't make it to the conference championship game. You know, it's there's a lot of questions that are going to have to be answered. And the problem with what's to blame for this is the super conferences, because now you're not having these teams are barely able to play half the conference on their
Yes.
conference schedule. And so you're going to have teams that dodge playing maybe the other two best teams in the conference or whatever the case may be. And so now all this stuff is just left up to, again, like we say, the eye test.
Yeah. And the eye test is imperfect. And the eye test also doesn't seem to age things up or down. And I think Notre Dame is getting the benefit of, hey, that win against Texas A&M is looking a lot better. To me, that's aging better. And again, they've been taking care of business lately, and they're going to get Army coming up, and that's going to be another win against the team that is in this playoff ranking. Sure, Army is not on the same level as A&M, but still, at the time that they play them, late in the season, they're not playing Army ranked in like week 3. This is really late in the season
Army has
now.
earned that ranking. Yeah.
Absolutely, right? But when I look at this too, what I see is the committee rewarding certain things and making assumptions on the other hand. Let's look at the ACC. I think we both have said the ACC is going to be a one-bid league. That seems to be a consensus across the board. However, if you look at this graphic, Miami is at 8, SMU is at 13. Currently, SMU leads the ACC standings. They're making what I think the committee is telling me by that is that they see a one-loss Miami team as in, and it almost makes me feel like they might have them in even if they don't win the ACC. You know what I'm saying? Because that's one that I don't really understand, because you'd think that they would flip-flop mainly because SEC is in the driver's seat for the ACC right now.
Yeah, I think that the ACC is at this point is a one-bid conference. It's going to be
Yes.
whoever wins the title game is in. I don't see any way that you could put a two-loss Miami into the playoff, unless some real wild shit happens in some of these other leagues, especially the SEC. It's going to be real interesting. And I was thinking about this as we were talking about, kind of how some of these teams have been, and like Army earning their ranking and being different. It's being different than if it was early in the season and they were ranked. If we can make the argument, and a lot of us made it, myself included last year, like Florida State when their quarterback got injured, if we could make the argument that this is not the same team as it was then, and believe it enough that a lot of us believed that Florida State should have been left out of the playoff, and the committee believed that too, why can't we believe that Notre Dame is not the same team they were in week 2 against Northern Illinois?
I think that they are. And I think it's a matter of like the Northern Illinois loss is probably, if you look at some of the losses that exist within this grid here, it's probably one of the worst in terms of quality losses. You know what I'm saying? And I
Sure.
think that's why but again, people are going to take Notre Dame and put them and say, this is why, right?
Right.
Or that's what's going to happen. Here's another example on this list. Do you recall BYU and SMU playing at the beginning of the season?
Yeah, BYU won because I was hammering SMU.
You called them SMPU, I believe is what you said. And look at that. SMU is ahead of BYU. And Budge, our friend again, was making an argument of, if you're talking similar resumes, how does head-to-head not matter? This tells me that head-to-head doesn't really matter. You know what I'm saying? And it's like SMU is trending upward BYU is kind of, I don't say they're trending downward. It seems like they're just sort of where they are, but that, I don't know. So like this where we are here, where it does add for a lot of debate, all the way down to like the 25 teams. Like there's so many things that could happen in here, but like below 15, so many of those teams do have a pathway of still making the playoff, despite the fact that we haven't talked about them nationally at all. Arizona State,
Yes.
Colorado.
Yeah. So is it out of line to say that maybe, and maybe I don't know if this has ever been stated by the committee, but that this ranking is supposed to be a snapshot in time, as a snapshot of a moment in time, as of the moment Tuesday night when they released this. This is what they perceived the rankings were, and without really any consideration for anything that had happened up until that moment. You know what I
And
mean?
maybe,
Just saying like, okay, like as if, we just watched all these teams this week. This is where we rank them. And I think that, almost saying records out the window, because this would not look much different if you just said, get rid of the records, tell me you rank the teams 1 through 25 who you think are the best
sure.
to whatever. It wouldn't look a lot different. So maybe there's a chance that they're saying like, hey, records aside, head to head aside, who do we think the 25 best teams in the country are?
Yeah.
Right now in this moment, like as far as how they're playing today.
But
Would you say there's anyone there that you would say like wouldn't fit that narrative?
I don't know if I'd say that they wouldn't fit the narrative, but I do also think as I'm looking at this and listening to you talk, that remember for years now I've talked about preseason rankings and how I felt like it kind of slotted certain teams in certain places and then they would just kind of move up. There is some of that embedded in here because every week we don't see a reshuffling. Like, no, I'm never going to argue Oregon shouldn't be number one. No problem with Ohio State number two. But Texas, Penn State, Indiana, Notre Dame, Alabama, like none of those teams seem to really shift all that much unless there is some type of a big win or a big loss. And it's like, why are we not like, it almost feels like these teams like Penn State, it's like, all right, boom, we're slotted here, we're good. Like we don't have to do any work. All we got to do is keep winning and we're just going to keep being here. We're not going to be evaluated on a week to week basis to say, oh, we didn't really play all that well. Maybe we'll move them down. That's always driven me nuts about the committee and about rankings and all that, because it's like, well, what does matter? Like if we're playing, and that's why even what you just said, like there's so many criteria that is there that you could go on and like reshuffle this whole deck. But sometimes I just don't feel like it's being reshuffled at all, except when there's some type of a head to head thing that matters now, but it doesn't matter later. Like, oh, it's a big deal that Georgia beat Tennessee, but somehow it's not a big deal that Notre Dame beat Texas A&M.
Right. And I think when it comes to the SEC, we've said this before. There's not an elite team in that conference, and I think that maybe we have 5 or 6 teams that are just really good, and the margin between them is very slim. Um, but that doesn't mean that they're all great either.
Right.
That's why I think it's very hard to decipher. Like, are they all bunched together because they're all really good, or are they all bunched together because none of them are that good? And when I say that good, I mean like great, right?
Elite.
Yeah.
Right. I think you and I both agree. I mean, Oregon struggled this week against Wisconsin, but I've been telling you about Camp Randall for
You
weeks,
have
so
been. You
that's
have
where that is. But it's a cross country game in an environment that they're not used to playing in. I don't know if it was cold or anything, but like it happens, right? Like good teams have off days. Oregon got their off day out of the way against Wisconsin, better than anybody else. But they've obviously looked the part this year. Ohio State has looked the part. But when you look at Georgia, we both agree that Georgia has not looked great. Like coming into this week against Tennessee, one of the announcers or commentators was like, Georgia has looked really good lately. And I'm like, did we just forget that they lost and looked like shit against Ole Miss? Like that was last week. And I feel like the narrative of these SEC teams changes from week to week where they're constantly being given the benefit of the doubt. Not saying that they haven't earned it. But let me ask you, would you put, let's say, Ole Miss, Georgia, Tennessee, even Alabama, they're all 2 lost teams, right? Now they're all 2 lost teams, SEC teams. If they were in the Big Ten, would they be 2 lost teams or would they be undefeated? I think if they were in the ACC, they probably would be in good shape. If they were in the Big 12, they probably would be in good shape. But it's football, man. You don't know that.
Right. And it's funny, I saw a video earlier and I wish I could remember the exact way that the guy phrased it, but he was sort of doing a role playing thing where someone was criticizing Indiana and being like, "Okay, they've played they've beat a bunch of not very good teams." And then like this guy picks out a couple teams in the SEC. He's like, "Oh, you mean like these teams have wins over Mississippi State, Florida, whatever." Just starts rattling off like a handful of teams in the SEC that are very strong. And then he's like, "Well, they have oh, what was it? Their best wins over this team." And like then he picked two of the SEC teams. Like, okay, well, this team's best wins over this team and this. I mean, it's like it was very comparable, and they were teams that are up here. The Alabamas, Ole Misses, Georgias, Tennessees, and it was just funny because it was very comparable, but the sort of national perception is so different. Even though Indiana's sitting at 5, because one thing that's interesting is there's 4 Big Ten teams right there in
Mm-hmm.
the top 5.
Sure.
I don't think there's a scenario where all 4 of them make the playoff.
It would be absurd.
I think the best case scenario is 3. Because Penn State's not gonna. I mean, they got a very very outside shot of making it to the conference championship game. I don't even know if they have a path. If Indiana beats Ohio State, then they would likely be in the conference title game against Oregon. And that's what's interesting too. Let's say Indiana beats Ohio State, but then Indiana loses to Oregon in the Big Ten title game. What do you do with 2-loss Ohio State at that point?
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, do you say, well, it was a tough loss on the road and, to the number 1 team? It's like,
but
and then how
then
do you leave Penn State
Indiana.
out with 1 loss?
Yeah, well, like so. But my question is like if Indiana has their only loss is to Ohio State, one loss Indiana and one loss Penn State, like are we comparing losses because they both will have lost to Ohio State? So how do you leave
That'll be
both of them
interesting.
out, right?
Well, you know what? Well, you have to look at this where they start. If you're saying right now today, I mean, Penn State has 1 loss and they're ahead of Indiana. So you
Correct.
would think that if Indiana takes a loss this week, that's only
They're
going to drop
done.
them further. I will almost project that if Indiana loses, they will fall out of the top 12.
That's absurd, though.
I think that's what happened, though.
I know that, but I don't disagree, but like that's absurd. Like they're an undefeated team. I understand that like their resume isn't anything compared to some of these other teams up here, but like they're not exactly playing in the ACC. They're playing in the Big Ten. They can only play who's on their schedule because of these super conferences. They don't get to play everybody. So like, would they be undefeated if they had to play Oregon and Penn State and Ohio? I don't think so, but we don't know that. So
Right.
we have to go with what we have. And like, it would be so shitty for an 11-1 Indiana team to be left out and have to play in like the Gator Bowl. Like that's ridiculous.
Well, what if they get ran out of the building by Ohio State? I mean, what if it's just
Okay,
a bloodletting?
that's fine, right? That's fine. But like, there's also, I don't know. Like, that's why I feel like it's just such a margin of error. Like there's such a thin margin of error, but yet a 1-loss Miami team whose resume can't be as good as Indiana's gets the benefit of the doubt.
So let's say that let's say that out of Ohio, I think Oregon's almost as sure of a thing as anybody, right? I gotta imagine they're almost
Kiss of
100%
death.
in. But
Yeah.
let's say one of the 3, Ohio State, Penn State, Indiana, doesn't make the playoff. Who is in line to be the beneficiary of that happening?
You mean who's out now and who would get in
Yeah, who do
if
you
that were
think
to
gets the
happen?
nod?
That's tough. I mean, because if you look at the teams that are there, so let's start at 13 and then we'll get to the projection. So SMU's got to win the ACC. It's obvious from the way that the committee has treated them. They have to win the ACC. So that's the only pathway there. So if they win the ACC, they're in, and that they're not a beneficiary of that.
And if they lose,
BYU,
they'd likely fall further, right? With the
100%.
loss, yeah.
Yes. BYU is in the same position, so nothing. Texas A&M, that might be a school, right? If they continue to win, get to the SEC championship game, you never know. They're a team that could be there. Colorado got to win the Big 12. Clemson got to win the ACC. South Carolina. Right now we're looking at a 3-loss. I think they're a 3-loss or 2-loss. Are they 2-loss? South Carolina?
I'll look right now. You can continue on. I'll look.
South Carolina is an interesting case because they have been trending upward and they've been playing really, really well. Do they have a pathway to the SEC championship game? I don't think so. But at the same time, you now have a team that could have some quality wins where they are at 18. They keep on moving up. could be on the outside in a couple of weeks whenever we're starting to debate these things.
Three
I mean,
losses.
what? Okay, so that could be tough. So they probably aren't a beneficiary. Army, they are going to play Tulane, who's right behind them in the American Athletic Conference Championship game, and they're probably going to lose to Notre Dame this week. And if they don't beat Tulane, obviously they have no chance. Tulane, as a group of 5 team, I don't think that they're going to get in. So, like, there's not a lot of teams that are going to get the benefit of the doubt from something like that because they all have a pathway, but the pathway is to win their conference. Arizona State somehow has a pathway to win, but they have to win their conference. Like, they're not, you know what I mean? Like, the only team, now that I think about it, oh wow, no, because they in order to run the table from here out to have only 2 losses, Colorado would have to win the Big 12. They're not going to let a 3-loss Colorado team in
Right.
just for Coach Prime. So
What
I don't
about
think
if
so.
what if okay, so let's say that Texas A&M loses to Texas. Okay, so that would give them 3 losses and then obviously they would not get an SEC championship game appearance at that point in time.
Correct.
And let's say that, whatever, BYU or Colorado, either one is going to be in. So like you said, an SMU, Miami, whoever loses those games is going to fall back.
Probably.
Look who's sitting there just waiting for all of this crazy shit to happen ahead of them. Number 17, Clemson. You know what I
Ooh,
mean? And they have 2 losses, I believe.
they
And I'll
do.
confirm they have 2 losses, and I believe the 2 games they have remaining are not difficult games. Now
Hmm.
they lose the tiebreaker to both SMU and Miami because they're going to have the same records.
Correct.
They lose a tiebreaker though because the one common opponent they all have is Louisville, and that's who beat Clemson lost to them. The other 2 beat them. So I think there's some sort of like a dark horse outside chance that Clemson finds their way into this mess.
Yes, but I think they really, really hurt themselves. They lose to Louisville recently. Was that their? No, they beat Louisville. Who was the loss that they had that
No,
was
they
not
lost.
great?
I'm pretty sure they lost to Louisville because
Okay.
um that was one of the games they had. That's the only common opponent for the tiebreaker that they had with Miami and SMU.
Yeah. So they're the like I guess the teams that could benefit from something like this, some type of chaos when it comes to the Big 10 or even the SEC are teams that technically don't have a pathway to their conference title game. So as long cuz you can't be hurt if you don't lose. You can if you don't play. But as you said, if you're a 9-2 Clemson team and you're
With losses
creeping
to
up there.
Louisville and Georgia.
Yeah, and Georgia looks fine, right? If Georgia ends up winning the SEC, that loss looks a lot better. Now they got blown out of the building, but it's week 1, so
Right.
you kind of forget about that. If we're gonna forget about Northern
You
Illinois,
just did what my dad
I
does.
did, I did. Then you're gonna have to forget about Georgia and Clemson if you're gonna make that argument. So I think what this proves is, and we're not even upset. Like I'm not saying that this is
No, I'm not either.
wrong. It's the analysis of it that just, I mean, it fascinates the hell out of me
I think it's like an
because
impossible task
it is.
almost.
I agree with you. People always thought that the NCAA tournament was impossible, but like in the end, you've got the 68, mostly the 68 teams. You're really only jockeying for what, 4 teams at that point. But like seeding, I mean, yes, certain teams get slotted in certain areas, and you're like, well, but again, it's like that. There's a lot that goes into that, and in the end, it's fine. But there's so few games that it's like so much harder, and there's so many things that could happen. We're not sure, but I think you nailed it. The super conferences, because what 9 out of 12 teams right now in this snapshot are from 2 conferences.
Yeah, and that's what's crazy. And I mean, we're also staring down the possibility of 6 SEC teams. And now hold on. Now, I think most of America believed that there was a damn good chance that something like that was going to happen
Of
when they went to
course,
the 12-team playoff, right?
of course,
And I'm not saying that 6 of those teams aren't deserving of it. I'm not even going to go there, but it's very crazy. And I don't know, maybe if the conferences were back to quote normal and they were reasonably sized conferences of like 10 to 12 teams, and they played a conference title game, and maybe it would be a little more clear cut, maybe not, I'm not sure. But if anything, the super conferences sort of I think they give the big conferences more credit for some of these teams that have great records but never have to play the top teams in the conference.
yeah,
You know what I'm saying? Because you're able to slide them in because all of a sudden, let's say if Penn State had to play Oregon, Ohio State, and Indiana, and so maybe now instead of 1 loss they have 3 losses. and are out of the picture entirely, and then that makes way for maybe another group of 5 school, and we can't have that. So,
Oh,
um,
well,
I
yeah.
mean,
I mean, that's absurd. We can have that. I know you're being sarcastic, but like, we
yeah.
should be able to have that. I mean, Tulane looks great right now. Like,
Well,
they
and
absolutely obliterated
they
Navy.
do. Well, and let's not forget that right now, I think they have Boise State seated 4th. They were the 4th
Yeah,
best ranked, 4th ranked conference champ,
let's take a look at that.
projected champ.
Actually,
Yeah.
yeah, we'll move to the projected bracket, which I love this view. It took me a long time to find this, by the way. A little peek behind the curtain. I don't know why I couldn't find it this week, but if you look at this right now, you're absolutely right. Beneficiaries of this model, Miami and Boise, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, and that's going to be the case. It's hilarious to me, and maybe this it's rude of me to think this. Maybe people obviously don't pay as much attention to this as I do, but it's hilarious how many people struggle with how this works, and that they don't understand that the top 4 seeds aren't necessarily the top 4 ranked teams,
That's a good point.
and
I've noticed
people
that too.
really struggle with wrapping their heads around how this is put together, and and I don't know, some of them you're just not gonna be able to help them, and that's fine. But
That's
uh,
just true.
there's a couple spots here, man, that are like this creates kind of sweet spots in the bracket, if you will. Like I think that the obviously the 5 seed is, if you don't have a bye, the 5 seed is like the sweet spot where
Yeah,
you
it's
want
where
to
it's
be.
at.
Next to that though, I think I would rather be in the 11-6 game. I think that's the next best spot, is to fall in one of those 2 spots. That's why, like Notre Dame, I would rather them fall to 11 than stay in that 8-9 game. Or even, I mean, even the 7-10's not great, So it's like if they can't get themselves all the way up to the 6th seed, I I mean, I don't know what could happen that would knock them back, truthfully. I think they can only go up with what's gonna happen ahead of them with throughout some of these conference title games and Indiana and Ohio State playing, and I think there's only room to go up as long as they keep winning. But if they can find their way into that 6th seed, that'd be pretty nice. I wouldn't mind that at all. And I'm sure there's a scenario where they could end up at the 5. I just don't know that that's likely.
I think the 5 is overpowered right now because the team that's in that slot happens to be Ohio State, and they are absurdly talented, or at least on paper, they are absurdly talented. And so it probably looks worse because that team it's an unequivocal top 2 team. You know what I mean? And so it might, I don't know if it'll look like that in future years if the team maybe isn't as good, but like I feel like when I look at it, I think, wow, Ohio State being there playing BYU, they should outmatch them. Boise, they should outmatch, and that gets them potential rematch against Oregon in the semifinals, and that's an easier path for sure. I mean, look at Notre Dame. For all the complaining that people did about Notre Dame being 6, what is their prize for that? Alabama followed by Oregon, if this were to follow. That's not exactly an easy path. That's like the hardest path.
Right. And it's also, hey, it's Notre Dame's chance to change the narrative a little bit.
100%.
And that's going to happen at some point. If they want people to shut up and they're to, to put an end to some of this criticism that's coming with the rankings and stuff right now, you got to start winning some of these ball games against um, these top teams. And I mean, I think Marcus Freeman's the guy to get it done, and we'll see. But they're going to get a shot at it here, and we'll see if they're able to handle it. But no, you're right. And it's funny. I'm looking at this and I can't help but think about last year. Like, think about last year. Like
Yeah.
Georgia probably would have been the 5 seed. You know what I
Yes.
mean? Last year, and just thinking about how like that would have like played out. One loss, ranked number 1 all season. Georgia, who loses in the SEC championship game, would have ended up being the 5 seed, and so then that would have plugged. And what's even more interesting is there's a possibility that would Alabama end up getting seeded? Were they 4th?
They were either, no. Yes, they were. I'm sorry, because they
So
played
then they
Michigan.
would be
Michigan was
so
one.
they would be they would well, you would have had probably well, I don't know. It probably would have been an ACC school or somebody else that would have slid into the 4th spot. It's really tough to think
Florida
about it, but
State.
well, they won the conference. Well, they would have gotten a bye, yeah. So I guess they still would have gotten their crack at it, but
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and that's the thing, right? Is this model is imperfect. I think we both recognize, or at least it has complications that we didn't know until we start going through it. There may be tweaks, but the model gives teams like Florida State, at least, because like I think if we're going by this model last year, if you and I are on the committee, we're putting Florida State in this field based off of their body of work throughout the entire year. Like, to
yeah,
not have them in the top 12 just because their quarterback's out, that's wholly unfair. I understood them dropping out of the top 4 because of that, because it's a much smaller sample. But in this, especially since they won their they won their conference, so like
Yeah,
they
they were
have to be in, and that they get a bye for that. And they who knows, maybe they would have been the lowest ranked. But like there's so many things, as you said, and when you start thinking about previous years, like it would be interesting to see where these teams are, because like there were a lot of teams like last year that we kind of started talking about eliminators, and like LSU was eliminated. You know what I mean? Like this year. And we talked about that last year, but like they would have hung on a little bit more. Remember the first year that we did this? LSU was a 3-loss team in the in the
in
SEC
the SEC
championship game.
championship. Yep.
Yeah. And so they would have been here, like, because we actually debated that. Would an SEC champion be left out with 3 losses? Because we're like, that's a hard argument to make, because the SEC champion kind of gets devalued at 3 losses, because back then having 3 losses was like you're done, and you're
Yeah.
not done here. So I'm excited. But if you think about some of the teams that are underneath, though, like Colorado and Ohio State in the first round is amazing.
Oh, it would be, I mean, epic. Absolutely epic. I mean, that's just it. We're going to get some really unique matchups that we would never see otherwise, which I'm really looking forward to, and kind of to put that in the perspective, like matchups we would never see. Kentucky is traveling to Texas this week to take on the Longhorns. This is the furthest west that Kentucky has traveled since like the 1950s, and that was to Austin, Texas. They have never traveled to play a football game further west than Austin, Texas. Now, granted, like
That's not even
75
that far west.
75% of like the college football programs are like from that line east. There's not a ton when you go west of there, but there's still plenty of good football programs, especially on the West Coast. And yeah, they've never played a game further west than Austin, Texas.
Well, keep in mind, Kentucky almost beat Georgia earlier in the year. Now, they kind of fell off, and certainly are like almost like a Kansas. But that's where we are. When we look at the matchups coming up for this week, that's where we are. Is we're in spoiler alert territory, right? We
Yeah,
are in,
there's a lot of
and that's
opportunities.
yes. And when you look at some of these games, so we'll just go through them. So Ole Miss at Florida. So one thing we didn't talk about is Florida decided to keep Billy Napier. We had been saying all year that he probably was going to lose his job. He doesn't, because the argument was made that he's actually done a fine coaching job, especially since they don't have a lot of talent for one reason or another. The transfer portal has just done so many things to these teams and these programs, and he's kept them competitive. And I believe they beat LSU this week, did they not?
Yeah, yeah, yep.
Yeah, which is just terrific. So it's not a gimme game for Ole Miss, and it's not a gimme game for some of these teams. Like, you're traveling on the road to a team that has nothing to lose, that is now playing for their coach because he has been kept. That's a dangerous game. And you asked if the Gators have momentum. They might. And they also have nothing to lose. They're dangerous.
Well, and let's remember too, like Ole Miss isn't a program that's been in a lot of these
No.
high stakes games. I know it's against a lesser opponent, at least on paper, but I mean they are playing for the ability to stay in the college football playoff right here down to the wire. And this program has not played in a lot of high stakes games, and Lane Kiffin has not coached in a lot of these types of games. And they've always been just on the outside of being in this situation late in the season. And so, we'll see how they handle that and the pressure that comes along with it.
Yes, I agree with you. And this is the opportunity for, as you said, new stars, December moments, and things like that. So that one will be interesting. But also, again, when you're a team that has nothing to lose, and you're a team like Ole Miss, who it's easy to get up for Georgia, but now you have to get up for Florida when you know you're better than them. It's just tough. Next game on the list, Colorado traveling to Kansas. Now, Kansas, as we said, just beat BYU. So you'd like to think that Colorado now, Coach Prime is like, all right, fellas, like they already ruined their dreams. We can't let them ruin ours. But I will say this. We haven't talked about them a lot, and I'm hesitant to do so. So I'm only going to say very, very small, nice things. But Colorado has really put it together. Granted, softer schedule than we thought that they would have. But Shadur looks really good. Travis Hunter looks really good. Maybe a Heisman winner. Like people are talking, he's got the best odds to win the Heisman right now. And they're playing like a football team that has gelled and know what they have to do. And the thing is, they haven't been chirping.
And I think when you look at Travis Hunter, speaking of the Heisman, it's really hard to make an argument that he's not the best player in the country.
It's
I mean,
insane.
the guy plays twice as many snaps as anybody else in the country on both sides of the ball and does it at an extremely high level.
That's the key.
Nobody else is doing that. It's
It's like
not like he
Otani.
only plays in spots on
Yes.
defense or in spots on offense. I mean, this dude is playing like Iron
He's
Man
playing
football.
the whole, yes.
And
He's basically playing the whole game.
yeah, and again, and at a high level, like he's making plays on both sides of the ball. He is arguably the best player on the field on both sides of the ball. I mean,
It's yeah.
I don't know how you can argue against him being the Heisman favorite.
And Colorado, Shadur Sanders, they have developed a relationship. They've developed a real chemistry, and you can tell. Like that's the Shadur Sanders that we're seeing now is the guy that we thought was kind of emerging at the beginning of last year, and then things fell apart because they just didn't have the big boys, as he said. But they're playing really, really well. But trap game on the road. But I like to think Kansas just beating BYU kind of takes a little bit of the sting away on that one. We already talked about Kentucky at Texas, so that's interesting. BYU and Arizona State. So BYU is stinging because their playoff hopes are now hanging by a thread. They have to win their conference. And Arizona State, the Sun Devils, it's amazing because the Sun Devils are a team we haven't talked about at all. We have
No,
not said a word
most of
about them.
America hasn't, outside of
Nope.
Budge.
Correct. And so now they have a path. They're the new Washington State because Washington State was in the rankings and they had a pathway to actually be like an at-large, having no conference, and then they went and shit the bed, and that's over with. So we won't see them again. But Arizona State definitely has a chance here. And again, these are two teams that they really both needed, but for different reasons. And I'm wondering if BYU is going to lose a little bit of confidence after losing that game, and Arizona State has them right where they want them.
Yeah, maybe so. You got to think they're coming off of the emotional win, emotional controversial win against Utah, the loss last week against Kansas, like the mental exhaustion that has to be taking its toll on BYU right now has to be at an all-time high, I would think. And then you add the desperation of having to find a way to win this game. I feel like Arizona State in a way is playing with house money because the expectations aren't there that maybe are there for BYU because those
Yes.
expectations have been in place at BYU for the last month, right? Once everybody
Yep.
saw they were rolling. Where
Hmm.
Arizona State, it's almost feels like just now, like people just woke up today and realized, holy shit, like Arizona State might find a way into the playoff.
Yeah. And they're learning. I mean, we're learning about some of these teams for the first time. Army and Notre Dame at Yankee Stadium. I mean, that's a pretty great backdrop. I think Notre Dame should win this game pretty handily because I've already seen this against Navy. They looked really, really good. Notre Dame is trending really high. Army doesn't really have anything to play for. I mean, they do and they don't because they've locked up their position in the conference championship game, and they could technically make the playoff, but it's a hard path. I just feel like Notre Dame should be able to come out in this game. They're going to look good. You already sent me the kits that they're going to be playing in. They're going to look great. I think they're going to play great too.
Yeah, I think so. I feel I mean, at this point, you got to be locked in, right? With what's on the line and everything else, you got to be locked in. And yeah, it's a tough offense to play against. And yeah, we saw it against Navy. Navy didn't. I mean, Navy, and even last year when Navy wasn't very good, they had some success with it. This year, they really struggled offensively against Notre Dame. And I don't know if that was just their execution or maybe Notre Dame's figured a few things out on the defensive end. But I know that during the bye week leading into the Florida State matchup for the first week when they didn't have a game, they did Army prep. Notre
That's a good
Dame did.
idea.
They did a week of Army prep, and then in game week they switched over to Florida State.
I was like,
And
tells you what
and
they
then
think of Florida State.
maybe I mean, and and so and it's just because it's such a unique offense, and you have to be very disciplined and sound to stop it. And it's one of
Hmm.
those things where you can't get behind against an offense like that because they will just drain the clock, man. Like they will drain the clock and limit possessions and opportunities. And so you have to be real sharp when you play an offense like this.
100% correct. So Texas A&M at Auburn. Is Hugh Freeze kind of coaching for his job down there?
I don't know, man. I think he gets another year. He's got. I mean, they stole a 5-star quarterback recruit from Notre Dame, flipped him Deuce Knight. I mean, so he's got some dudes coming. Um, so I think that we'll see. Well, I don't know. I think they hang on to him, and he's got an opportunity here to get kind of a signature win, whether against A&M or Alabama in the Iron Bowl,
Yes, he does. And speaking of
and
coaches
play
who are
spoiler.
probably there. Brent Venables, Oklahoma, not look good in their first
No.
SEC season. And if I think Venables might be in trouble because they had Dylan Gabriel and he's no longer there anymore. And obviously, we see how great Oregon is. So it's like Brent Venables was a guy who didn't take any head coaching jobs because he was with Clemson and doing so well. And then he gets a good one. I mean, Oklahoma, I would consider in like not S tier, but probably A tier programs in terms of like head coaching jobs. And it's not going great. They haven't looked like Oklahoma. And I just feel like this is a game that he's going to need to have if he's going to argue in the offseason, like, hey, keep me. Because now in the SEC, these programs are going to get rid of guys. They're not going to keep them around for very long because you got to win.
You're right about that. It's funny. Think about let's go back a couple years when it was announced that Oklahoma and Texas were going to make this move. If I would
Mm-hmm.
have told you, hey, the first year that Oklahoma and Texas are in the SEC, um, Oklahoma and Alabama are going to play the second to last week of the regular season, and it's going to be such a meaningless game that you might not even turn it on. You know what I mean? Like, because that's where we are, right? This game essentially is meaningless. This game has no gravity to it at all whatsoever. I mean, outside of the chance that Oklahoma upsets them, right? But I
Sure.
don't know that anyone. That's just not something that's a likelihood at this point. So you have something that on paper should be this like uh, prestigious, tradition-filled heavyweight matchup, and it's a dud. And so again, that this is perception. It could turn out to be the greatest college football game ever played once they tee it up, but it certainly doesn't have the appeal that I think we all expected it to.
No, it doesn't at all. Like it just has no appeal. So speaking of games that don't have an appeal, let's talk about three that are not playoff worthy, but at least are worthy of our attention. So Vanderbilt at LSU. Vanderbilt gets a night game. Now Brian Kelly was undefeated in night games at LSU up until they lost to Alabama, but I would love to see Vandy win this game, but I feel like LSU they do really well here. But night game, Death Valley, you kind of said it. It's like there are some places that are peak college football, and that's definitely high on the list.
It is, which is why I it would be so satisfying like to see Van just because of the way things are
Yeah.
trending for LSU and Brian Kelly. It would be very satisfying to see Vandy go in there and get a win in that environment. I mean, that would be a huge win for their program too. And Clark Lee, I mean, my goodness, like what a job he's done. We were talking about him being on the hot seat at the beginning of the season,
We were.
and here he is, right? I mean, he's as solid as could be. So, it'll be interesting to see what happens there and what happens with Brian Kelly's future if this doesn't go his way.
That's a good one. And we were going to talk NFL, but I want to expound on these a little bit before we get out of here. But Brian Kelly. So, Brian Kelly, I think I asked you this offline. I don't remember if I did or not, but it's like Brian Kelly started lower level schools, worked his way up, kind of the way that it always used to be. I think it's a little bit different now. I feel like guys jump a lot higher than they used to because the desperation to win is so high. But Brian Kelly has been at places a long time. So he's not the kind of guy who goes someplace, gets what he needs out of it, and then jumps. I mean, he was at Cincinnati for a long time, very solid program. Obviously, Notre Dame, he's the winningest head coach in Notre Dame history. He was there for a very long time. He's in year 4 now, right, with LSU.
I believe so, yeah.
And that's not a long time comparative to other places. And he's really, honestly, staring at having lost his locker room. And if that's the case, he's out. Like they're not going to keep him if this 2-3 loss seasons keep going. But then where does he go from there? Because technically speaking, LSU I would consider probably an S tier job, no?
It is for sure. Yeah, it's up there. And yeah, where do you go from here? I don't know. Because like I said, I mean, there's maybe a couple places that would entertain you if which I know Kirk Signetti just signed like an 8-year deal and says he's not going anywhere and
Yeah,
maybe he's going to be the one guy that means it when he says it. We'll see.
he won't.
My dad will be so disappointed to find out that there's no loyalty left and coaching,
Bloomington, Indiana.
um but I mean, or like if Bill O'Brien gets a job somewhere at a Boston college, BK is from the Northeast. He's definitely like got that sort of demeanor to him. He's coached and succeeded at a Catholic school before that has maybe the academic limitations and stuff like that. So you would think that maybe that's a spot that would be a good fit. I don't know. Maybe there's some Big 12 schools out there that we're not thinking of, where there could be openings and things like that. And what if Prime moves on? Brian Kelly replaces Coach
Oh my
Prime at
God.
Colorado. What a culture shift that would be.
Shock. Well, it's just fascinating because Brian Kelly is obviously a good football coach, but I think that what has followed him is the narrative that he can't win the games that they need him to win. Because you've said that about him at Notre Dame. It was like he always won the games he wasn't supposed to, but never won the games he actually absolutely had to, or whatever it was. It was something
Yeah.
similar to that. And at LSU, you really can't afford that because almost every game that you play is a game that you have to win because you're constantly playing good talent week in, week out. And it's like, is the SEC just too much for Brian Kelly?
It could be, and I think culture matters, man. Fit matters. And Brian Kelly's a good football coach. He's won a lot of football games, and I'm grateful for what he did in his time at Notre Dame. But um, it's pretty unanimous that he's an asshole.
Yes,
There's not a lot of
100%.
people that disagree with that, and we've seen glimpses of his personality in these press conferences and things like that. He's not great at accepting responsibility for what happens. He points the finger a lot. There's off the field stories. When he left Notre Dame, like he ghosted his assistant coaches. Like he never like told them like, "Hey, I'm taking the LSG." Just fucking left. Like, and then
That's awful.
there's stories of him like inviting the staff when he was coaching at Central Michigan before he went to Cincinnati. And this story has kind of made its rounds in the media, but um, he was hosting a big party at his house, and he invited the assistant coaches who thought they were going to be guests at the party. He had them valet park the cars for the guests. That's what he
Nice
did.
guy.
So it's like, the guy's a prick. So I can't imagine that. I don't know that sort of shtick plays well in today's college locker room, unless you're winning. Unless you're like a Saban that's got you got the trophies in the trophy case and all the NFL draft picks to prove it. I don't know. I mean, be a great concession card operator. That's
But
fine.
at the same time, looking at the next game, USC UCLA doesn't matter at all, except for the fact that it's a fun tradition where they both wear home jerseys. Never really
Yes.
understood why we don't do that more often. Lincoln Riley, though, Lincoln Riley now is in the Big Ten. His coaching style, his recruiting style is, I would say, a direct antithesis to what Big Ten football has been historically. And they're struggling. Like this year, remember when they beat LSU, we thought, okay, like maybe there's some things that they're putting together. And then it fell apart very, very quickly. And I
Yeah.
wonder, Lincoln Riley, is the Big Ten too much for him, for his coaching style? Does he need to be at a place or a conference like the Big 12 where you can do big offense, no defense? Because they didn't adjust at all. And I would assume the school's willing to give him a year to adjust to the Big Ten.
I
But
think so.
next year, got to put it together, right?
Yeah, he's definitely got more grace than what Brian, because they're both in year 4, and he's definitely got more grace than what BK is getting at LSU. While USC has a great tradition of winning, I don't think that they're as obsessed as the fine folks of Louisiana are when it comes to their football, and so I think he's going to get some time, and I would hope so. I'd hope that boosters and athletic departments and presidents understand, especially there, it's going to take some time to adjust to the type of recruiting you have to do to compete in the Big Ten. And, so we'll see. I mean, he'll get a chance to adjust, and we'll see if he's able to make it happen.
And last, Brent Pry, probably coaching for his job, if I'm being perfectly honest, as the Hokies travel to Durham to face Duke. So if they win their last 2 games, they do find themselves in 7-win territory, which technically speaking is an improvement from last year. But I'm not going to lie to you. I feel like this team has underperformed with all the expectations. And yeah, they're playing to be bowl eligible, but they made a bowl last year. So let's hope that they can at least do that. But I don't know. Maybe they give Pry one more year, and they might, but it doesn't have a good vibe to me.
Yeah, it definitely doesn't have the way, think about a year ago, how we felt about Virginia Tech and Brent Pry
Hmm.
in the future. And it just seems like, that optimism has faded, and rightfully so when you look at the results. And I don't know. I think that, I mean, where do you go from there? That's also
It's
the
always the
question. That's a
hardest
question that
question.
a lot of these schools have to answer.
Brian
And
Kelly.
I was going to say that's exactly what I was going to say. Is your worst nightmare would be if they move on for Britt Bryan. Here comes Brian Kelly to Blacksburg. But
What would I do? What would I do in that?
Ooh.
That's a good. What would I do in that scenario as a lifelong, well, mostly lifelong Hokie fan at this point? How would I feel if they hired Brian Kelly? That's tough. I'm not going to lie to you. Like,
The
you
guy
know
wins
me,
football games. I
he
mean,
does, right.
which
But my issue, and well, I guess for the sake of this show, we would have a weekly check-in on my mental
right.
health because but I don't think it would ever happen because I just think everything that comes with him. First of all, he would never live in Blacksburg, Virginia. Let's just put it that way. He never
Right.
would. Because like if you look where I mean South Bend, Indiana, but like the prestige that comes with being at Notre Dame, I feel like kind of uplifts you there, and you kind of he's like a god almost like at Notre Dame. But like in Blacksburg, like it's much different than Notre Dame, and I just can't see him slumming it up with the fine folks of Blacksburg, Virginia. But like I would have trouble because I'd be like, he's gonna win a lot of football games, but I also think he's a shithead, and I don't want that for my program. But maybe that's my problem is I want a nice guy or at least a morally
A guy you
non-morally
can root
corrupt
for.
guy. A guy you can root for, but apparently those guys only are mid.
Right. Or Marcus Freeman.
Hey, that's true. That's a good point. And Marcus Freeman right now is sitting at the sixth best team in the country. And you know what? They have done a lot. But the playoff, there's still what? How many weeks left? 3 technically?
Two. I think
Two,
just
but like conference
yeah,
championship
two, and then
games.
the conference. Yes. Which actually, so I guess we'd have would Army Navy, is that game technically played after the conference championships?
It is. Yes.
Okay, so then I think we just have 2 weeks then. So this week, next weekend, and then conference title. I mean, we're up against it, man.
We are up against it. So we're going to have a couple more debates about that. And how do you feel about a pick of the week this week, buddy?
I'm willing to give one a go.
All right. You ready?
Off the cuff.
It's been a while, buddy. We'll go off the cuff. But last time you made a pick, you picked Texas Tech to beat Colorado. Didn't work out. You're 7-3. So now you need to look at the scoreboard and they're going to say, pick me, pick me, pick me. And you're going to pick a complete BS game. But if you are ready, please bless us with a pick of the week.
Hear ye, hear ye. Happy to be back in the saddle of the pick of the week, here to serve all of your money-making needs as you tail these wonderful picks. As you see the record there on the screen, 7-3. Come here to get all the winners all day, every day, 10 weeks a year, apparently. We got it right there for you. This week, this is not a BS game. This is one I believe in. I believe in this game, and I'm willing to put my neck on the line, my expertise, my reputation, if you will, on the line for this pick. We are going to the swamp, Iceman. What reputation? The reputation is being an expert prognosticator.
Perfect.
Okay, we are going to the swamp in Gainesville, Florida. I knew a guy that once went down there for a job interview, went to eat at a restaurant, and someone said, "Why in the world are you going to Gainesville?" And apparently he found out that they actually refer to it as the dirty. So I didn't know that about Gainesville. So interesting enough. Fun fact for you. So the Ole Miss Rebels, Lane Kiffin and the boys, travel to Gainesville, Florida to take on the Gators. Billy Napier has had new life breathed into him by the fact that Florida's announced they're going to retain him. Ole Miss, they're shaking in their boots, trying to find a way to stay into the playoff hunt. I'm not just taking the points. I'm taking the Gators to win outright and ruin, destroy, and crush Ole Miss's playoff hopes.
7-4 incoming. So let it be written. So let it be done. What can I say? I have been to Gainesville. I've been to Gainesville multiple times. And the one time I went there, I'll tell the story very quickly. It was homecoming and we went to a bar and it was, have you ever been to a bar that does a beat the clock challenge?
I cannot say that I have.
Okay, so it's very fun, and you start at a certain time, and every hour that goes by, the price of beer goes up. So it incentivizes you to get in early. And I was a working professional. I was not a college student, but
I
it's a
have
college
been at
bar.
a bar like this. I have been at a bar like this in Morgantown, West Virginia.
Beat the clock. It's actually very fun if you're in the mood for it. But anyway, so I went up there and I said, "Well, what is the initial price?" And they're like 50 cents. I was like, "I'll buy one for the whole bar because it's a college bar and I'm a working professional, so I can actually afford this." And they're like, "It's going up to 75 cents in an hour." I was like, "I think we're good." So I was not in any rush. And it was like, these are old prices. I'm sure that's like $3 and it goes up to $10 now with inflation and all the other good stuff. But buddy, I had a good time. Do you have anything else you'd like to say to everybody who is watching?
No, been a blast as always. It's fun to do it. Looking forward to arguing again next week about the college football playoff. It will be wonderful, and then soon enough we'll have the playoff field in place, and then we can sit there and make our predictions as far as how we're going to see it play out. And it's going to be exciting. I'm really looking forward to it. We said it a couple months ago, and I think we can double down on it. And that is the fact that this is has been and is going to continue to be the most exciting college football season we've ever had.
Absolutely. It certainly has. So if you want to follow us, you want to follow us anywhere, you can find us all over social media, Apple, Spotify, all that good stuff. I don't really feel like saying all of it because you're going to see our ugly faces for a little bit more, especially all the way through college basketball season. So for me and Coach, hope this finds everybody well and safe. And you know what, man? We'll see them all down the road. This is Football Frenzy.